The final warning. Why this ex-pilot will never fly again. The cockpit goes quiet the second the altimeter jitters. An object hangs dead still at 24,000 feet while a 120-knot wind rips past. Say again? His voice catches. The it-fleur jitters, crosshairs slide, and the HUD blinks like a bad heartbeat. Command says continue the mission, he can't. Career on the line, squadron listening on push, the ship recording every syllable. Our pilot isn't a myth, he's a composite of voices from declassified Navy and Air Force incidents. Tonight, we follow the spiral, the fallout, and the paper that ended his flight status. To understand the final warning, we go back to the first sighting. First contact, the impossible hold. They briefed it like a Tuesday. Weather over the range looked ugly, sea level ducting, layers that bent radar beams like mirrors. Standard rules of engagement, emissions control, nothing exotic. He noted the fuel plan twice because ducting can keep you chasing ghosts. He didn't know the ghost would be waiting. On climb out, the radio had that clean, metallic confidence that settles you into the seat. The flight lead joked about Chow. His wingman chewed on a pen and ran the same checks he always ran, callouts clipped and automatic. Then the controller voice shifted. Fast mover, Bulls 270, Angels 24, stationary relative. Stationary and fast in the same sentence didn't compute. He rolled to pick up the radar picture and let the pod slide onto the mark. There was not a bird, not a balloon. No tumble, no drift. It held like it had bitten into the sky. Wind was howling from the west at 120 knots, high shear. The white caps below skittered sideways. This thing didn't care. Heart rate spiked. He felt the tightness come into his breath and switched to the breathing drill they'd drilled 1,000 times. In 6, hold 2 out 6. Hands settled, eyes up. Merge plot came fast. The blip didn't grow, it flickered. The HUD tried to make sense, velocity vectors jumped, then steadied on nothing. 2 tally? The wingman's banter stopped mid-syllable, a mic click and silence. The flight lead cut the humor. Stay wide. I'll press. You can hear when someone's voice gets shorter. It got shorter. He eased forward line, let the pod attempt a lock. The crosshairs drifted like they were on oil. An angle off that should have been simple turned slippery. The pod did what it does when it can't believe its own math. It yawed through and hunted. Lock, lock, break lock, he heard himself say. The object snapped from 24,000 to wave top in the time it took the word break to leave his mouth. No pressure wave. No sonic crack. Just a vanishing and a reappearing, and the ocean didn't even flinch. Training says don't chase the hole in your thinking. He checked fuel, checked altitude, checked separation. The controller sounded like someone reading a script underwater. Skin paint intermittent. Possible clutter. Clutter doesn't hold stationary against 100-knot wind. Clutter doesn't drop to the deck and park. He asked the simple question. Request continue intercept. Command came back calm as a surgeon. Continue mission. That answer felt like someone had pressed a thumb on the back of his neck. The squadron on frequency went quiet in a way that makes you aware of your own breath. He chose to bracket it, hold altitude, and watch. He wasn't going to dive into a problem he couldn't describe. Then the ocean lit, just a hair brighter where it sat, like a heat mirage doing the wrong thing. He slipped the jet left, kept the object off the nose, and called his wingman to move high cover. No reply at first, then a single word. Visual. The lead's voice came back clipped. Knock it off, reset. And the word knock ended the practice. They were out of the scenario, and into whatever this was. Fuel started to matter. They'd burned a clean plan into a dirty sky. If they chased low, they'd eat into bingo. He weighed it. Intercept and risk a tanker scramble, or hold, and bring home a clean record. The brief had been about not making a mess. The air did it for them. He watched the object slip along the wave tops without touching them. In the pod, there was a bloom where the crosshairs thought heat should be, then a smudge as if the software was correcting for something it didn't recognize. He wanted the sound of a boom, just to tell him the world still had rules. It didn't come. His wingman finally found words. This isn't right. That was the last joke they'd tell for the next 2 hours. Command asked for an update, voice even. He gave them words that felt like twine. Object stationary against winds, altitude variable, pod unable to maintain stable track. The lead added a fuel state, suggested reset. Approval slid back across the air, like an official stamp. He climbed, set a course away from the puzzle, and watched it with the corner of his eye. It stayed. It didn't chase, didn't pulse, didn't act like anything with wings. What got him wasn't the drop. It was the stillness, the way it refused the wind. He'd spent a life reading air, how it curls off a wingtip, how it bites at the canopy. This was a hole where air should have been. On the way home, checklist cadence came back. He spoke it like a prayer. The wingman said nothing for a full minute. When he finally did, he said, "We're not writing that up like that." He felt a small crack run through the trust he kept with physics and procedure. He was already editing a future he hadn't lived yet. Back aboard, the noise of the deck washed the sky out of him for a second. Then the crew chief asked a question with his eyebrows. He gave a version that didn't sound like a joke. The chief's face didn't change, but he made a note. Down below, sailors would log an intermittent track that didn't behave like rain. He walked into the ready room and tasted the stale coffee smell like it was new. The flight lead closed the door with his foot. "We'll keep it clean," he said. That meant they'd write what the book liked. Not a lie, just something the book could digest. He nodded because he wasn't ready to argue with a book. That night, his hands practiced switches in the air over his kitchen table. His kid had a homework packet and asked why clouds look like mountains at sunset. He said something about angles and dust. He didn't say he'd watched an object ignore 100-knot wind like it had a private treaty with the sky. He lay down and trusted his training to put him to sleep. It didn't. He replayed the drop, trying to hear a boom that never came. He listened for vortex rings, for anything that fit. Silence answers with more silence. In the morning, they briefed another intercept. Weather had shifted. The talk turned to refueling windows and radio procedures. He sat a little straighter than usual. When the controller voice came through the wall again from the neighboring room, the hairs rose on his arms. He pressed his thumb against the table edge until it hurt. Pain is a fine anchor. While the sky went quiet, the ground had already started to hum. Down in the Combat Information Center, sailors argued with the spy console about what counts as a track. In maintenance, someone wrote anomalous behavior with a pencil and erased it, then wrote intermittent return instead. Language learned how to step around the hole. He didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that a still point had opened in the air and swallowed a rule he'd lived by. He was going to fly again, and he was going to bring that crack with him. The radar that wouldn't lie until it did. While he taxied in, the ship had already started its quiet argument with reality. In CIC, the spy operators were juggling returns that came and went like bad conscience. Fast movers at impossible velocities, then nothing, then a smear that leapt 30 miles in a sweep. The senior operator pinned a strip on the plot board anyway. You log what you see, or you stop being useful. On deck, he walked his report to maintenance. The crew chief flipped through the forms and pointed with a grease-black fingernail. "Pod drift." He nodded. At Fleur attempted lock, angle off inconsistent, break lock events. The chief wrote, paused, and replaced the phrase anomalous behavior with intermittent stabilization. Words matter, especially when they'll be read by people who weren't there. Down below, controllers were speaking carefully. "Skin pain intermittent," the air intercept controller said, keeping the word bug out of his mouth. Skin pain is supposed to be the truth, the raw reflection from a thing that is actually there, not just software hallucination. When skin goes intermittent on a clear day, your stomach finds a new gravity. The ship's log began to fill with small hedges, ducting, sea clutter, chaff from training evolutions. Meanwhile, the Et Fleur techs ran their checklist like a legal deposition. Gimbal limits? In spec. Gyros? Fine. Calibration? Verified. They piped a test image and watched the pod lock and track like it was born for it. No defects noted. The tech initialed the line and looked up at him with a neutral face that said, "The gear's good. If it's not the gear, it's the world." He sat with the tapes. The pod footage showed crosshairs, sliding like a finger on a fogged window. The object's aspect should have given the algorithm something to bite. Instead, the pod danced a half step behind, as if the target kept moving just outside the predictive model. He'd been taught about Kalman filters and how the software guesses the next frame of motion. This thing kept stepping off the guesses, like it knew where the math would land and refused to be there. In radio recordings, he heard his own voice go up half a note. He also heard the gap when the wingman didn't answer, a small, ugly silence that only pilots recognize. He rewound it twice, then closed his eyes. The room hummed with the ship's heartbeat and the air conditioner that always sounded like rain. Controllers held a scrub meeting that afternoon. The lead operator ran through the timeline. At time 12:31 Zulu, spy detects a high-altitude stationary contact, bearing 270 at 90 miles. Intermittent returns, variable SNR. Subsequent tracks exhibit rapid displacement between sweeps. A junior asked about false tracks due to anomalous propagation. The lead didn't blink. We ran the algorithm. Some AP indicated, but not consistent with the displacement. Could it be jamming? Another voice offered. The EW officer shook his head. No associated emissions. Nothing on the spectrum we monitor. If it's messing with us, it's doing it quietly. Quiet jamming felt like saying a shadow was loud. He took the eventual pod list to the shop. One tech rubbed his forehead. We've seen this once. Pod loses stable lock when target maintains zero aspect changes, while moving laterally beyond predicted rate. The software expects a rotation, some parallax. It got nothing. He thanked him and walked the passageway, hand brushing the cold pipe, cataloging the ship's smells. Diesel, sweat, citrus cleaner, salt. The normal world asserting itself. In the ready room, the tape made its first unofficial appearance. A few seconds of the lock and brake on a training reel meant to show common tracking pitfalls. Laughter, mostly to bleed off the pressure. Look at that, it jukes like it owes money. He forced a grin. Behind the jokes, eyes stayed on the frames longer than usual. Someone paused and stepped closer. Back it up. The banter slowed, then stopped. You could feel the room decide not to decide. He filed a write-up that avoided certainty. Observed object displayed hold against forecast winds, rapid altitude change without associated acoustic or visible aerodynamic signatures. Sensor behavior inconsistent with known failure modes. He left space for the maintenance notes. He left out the part where his chest tightened. There's no field for that. Up the chain, the note drew exactly the amount of attention he'd hoped to avoid. A staffer added a line. No further action at this time. It looked bureaucratic and harmless. It felt like a door with a deadbolt on the inside. The message, we see you, we're not touching this. Keep flying. Meanwhile, word crept. Hangar talk travels faster than a memo because it's carried by people who need to say it out loud to make it real. A controller who'd watched the track blink off and untold a buddy in ordnance during a smoke break. It outran the sweep. The buddy laughed, then asked for details, then went quiet and changed the subject. He took another look at the spy printouts. The tracks made a constellation you couldn't name. Jumps that didn't smear like radar errors usually do. No hooks, no scallops, just point-to-point relocations that made the map look like a child's connect-the-dots drawn by someone who hated lines. He traced it with his finger, feeling foolish and compelled. That night, the Itfleur shop chief found him by the soda machine. We rear-end calibration. Pod's clean. If anyone asks, that's the line because it's the truth. He nodded. The chief dropped his voice. For what it's worth, I saw the frames. Gear did what it could. It wasn't comfort, but it was company. He pulled flight data from the jet. Angle of attack, G, airspeed, pitch, roll, yaw. The numbers told a boring story. His jet behaved. The weirdness wasn't in his hands. That matters to pilots. If the ghost is in you, you can attack it. If it's outside, you start checking long-held beliefs for cracks. On the bridge, a junior officer asked the captain whether to file a safety advisory. The captain stared at the horizon for 3 beats. We'll log it. We won't alarm. He didn't say don't. He didn't have to. By the second day, the problem had a shape. Sensors that rarely agreed all agreed on something they couldn't hold. Radar saw and didn't. Infrared bit and slipped. Radio logs captured normal voices saying abnormal things. And the maintenance forms that usually read like a lullaby picked up a thread of careful language that stretched across departments. When he stepped into CIC the next watch, a new return had popped 30 miles north, then vanished before the next sweep. The operator kept his hands flat on the console. Sir, we get yelled at for chasing angels. We also get yelled at for missing threats. Today's a both day. He stood behind him and watched the green phosphor breathe. He wrote himself a note. Trust the instruments until you can't, then trust your eyes until you shouldn't, then trust your training to bring you home. It sounded like something you'd put on a classroom wall. It didn't fix the part where the world had shrugged at the rules. By evening, the official word was unchanged, no further action. Unofficially, a new story was taking on weight, the kind that bends conversations. Guys who'd called balloons by their first. Names started sitting straighter when the tape rolled. The words skin paint intermittent became shorthand for the way certainty dies. The day ended with him in a chair, staring at a still frame where the crosshairs almost held. He thought about the software predicting where a target would be, and the target refusing to be predicted. He thought about his breathing drill and how it worked on heart rate, but not on doubt. He closed the laptop and listened to the ship settle. The tape wouldn't stay quiet. It never does. The debrief that changed his name. They put him in the small secure room with the beige walls and the single humming vent that always made the ceiling feel lower. The intelligence officer walked in with a legal pad he didn't intend to fill. "Just the facts," he said, and the tone said, "Keep it small." The recorder's red light came on. He felt his mouth go dry, like his body was trying to hide the words. He started with the timeline. Launch at 12:09, intercept window 12:30. Controller calls stationary contact 24,000. The intel officer raised a finger. Use UAP for the contact. He nodded. UAP stationary relative to high winds. Another finger. Avoid vehicle. We aren't characterizing. He edited in real time, trimming words that might later be used to cut him. He described the hold against the wind, the drop, the brake lock. Pod behavior inconsistent with known failure modes. The officer leaned forward. Say pod did not maintain lock. He swallowed the difference. Precision mattered, but so did survival. The gray-haired Master Chief in the corner watched him like he was reading a gauge. Any acoustic signatures? No. Any visible propulsion? No. Any emissions on EW? Negative. The officer's pen didn't move. Weather anomalies? Ducting. Not consistent with displacement observed. He could hear himself slipping into clean, careful phrasing, the language of trying not to step on mines. Then the officer did the tilt he'd been waiting for. Is it possible fatigue contributed? He'd flown long cycles before and never misread the wind's hand. Possible? Sure. Likely? No. The officer nodded as if that settled something. It settled nothing. Keep this out of the log if it's noise, the officer said offhand, like he was talking about coffee grounds. We don't want to clutter the system. There was a career hint sitting right under the sentence like a tripwire. The Master Chief's eyes flicked to him and away. He heard a second voice in his head. Protect the crew. He edited mid-sentence. He cut out the part where his wingman went silent for a beat that meant fear. He left the human out and kept the numbers in. Crew cohesion intact, he said, and hated how it sounded. The officer nodded, finally letting the pen scratch. Good. We avoid speculation. Speculation was a synonym for the thing that can ruin you. They compared his sanitized account to the maintenance draft. Where he'd said inconsistent, the shop had said intermittent. Where he'd said hold against winds, the shop wrote stationary relative. He knew the game. Triangulate the safest version and call it truth. He placed his handwritten flight notes on the table, the ones he'd scribbled minutes after shutdown, shaky lines, real words. The officer looked at them and asked, "Do you need to retain those?" He heard the subtext. "Do you intend to keep a copy?" He slid them back into his folder. For accuracy. The officer's expression didn't change, which was an expression in itself. He was asked to draw a sketch. He drew the ocean, the altitude bands, the object's positions, dots without lines because the lines implied continuity and continuity implied physics. The officer tapped the wave-top dot. "You're certain?" He remembered the absence of a boom, the way the water didn't ripple. Certainty felt like a costume, but he wore it. "Yes." "Recommend course of action?" the officer asked, routine words that felt ceremonial. He said the only thing he could say that didn't throw anyone under a bus. Safety advisory regarding range intrusions. Request additional sensor coverage. The officer wrote note range safety and left out intrusions. Language was a hedge fund. Then the word games turned sharper. Did you feel threatened? If he said yes, they could call him excitable. If he said no, they could call it inconsequential. He split the hair. Potential collision risk existed. The officer smiled, small, professional. It was the smile of a file growing teeth. The Master Chief finally spoke, voice like gravel. "You're not the first to see weird. You won't be the last. Keep it in the lane and you'll be fine." It sounded like advice. It also sounded like a boundary. He nodded, because not nodding would be a choice with a price tag. The officer clicked off the recorder and shifted into a warmer register. "Off the record, if this is noise, let's not feed it. People get reputations." He heard the capital. Letters. Reputations travel faster than facts and stick longer. He didn't say anything. Silence is its own checkbox. They released him back into the brighter corridors, where the fluorescent lights hummed at exactly the wrong frequency for thinking. Two aviators leaned near the water fountain, and went quiet when he turned the corner. One of them glanced at his name patch and looked away fast. In units like this, names morph. By dinner, he heard the first version of his new one under someone's breath. That pilot. Not the ace, not the reliable section lead. That pilot. You never want to be that anything. He sat in the ready room and watched the debrief tapes roll for another flight, familiar radio calls, clean intercepts, the comfort of everything looking like it should. The Squadron XO walked in, rested a hand on the back of his chair, and left it there a second too long. "Keep it tight," the XO said. It meant more than formation spacing. He opened his notebook and compared the sanitized report to his notes. In his notes, object refused wind. In the report, contact stationary. In his notes, pod hunts target beyond model. In the report, pod did not maintain lock. Both were true. Only one would keep a career from fraying. He called his wingman and got voicemail. He stared at the phone like it might offer a compromise. When the wingman called back later, the first words were, "We good." He said, "We're good." Neither of them believed it. The wingman added, "I'm not going to be the guy." He didn't ask which guy. He knew. Next morning, he was scheduled to fly again. He walked the line and felt the jet like you feel an old friend's mood. The plane smelled like fuel and warmed metal. He strapped in and heard the crew chief's voice through the comm panel. "You good?" He said yes. Nobody asked different. On startup, the tower voice used his call sign with the neutral tone that means the speaker knows things and won't say them. He taxied with the small correction taps you use when you want to prove to yourself you're still smooth. He was. Skill wasn't the question anymore. In the climb, he realized the label had come aboard with him. It sat where confidence usually Saturday. That pilot rode along, uninvited and extra weight. He checked himself in the mirror on the left canopy rail and saw somebody who looked like him but thought about wind like it had secrets. The mission was uneventful. He flew it by the book and shaved none of the corners. Back down, the XO nodded once. A tech from at Fleur walked past and didn't meet his eyes. The Master Chief caught his sleeve in the passageway and said, "Low. Write what you saw. Don't write what you think." He heard the compassion under the caution. He returned to the secure room for a signature. The intel officer slid the sanitized report across. He read it twice. It was accurate in the way a map is accurate. It showed the roads and left out the hills. He signed. The officer capped his pen. "Will mark no further action." The words were supposed to soothe. They sounded like an epitaph. He left with a new name pinned to him that he hadn't chosen. In a community where your call sign is a story and your story is currency, the exchange rate had shifted. The label followed him out to the flight line, into the next brief, into the small pauses when conversations fracture around a subject that feels like heat. It would follow him farther than he thought. Night flights and silent panic. He tried to treat the next cycle like any other. Pre-flight at dusk, lineup briefing, a clean plan. Sleep the night before broke into 4 pieces. He woke at 1:13, 2:41, 3:18, each time replaying the drop and the way his voice had climbed half a note. By morning he'd started triple-checking checklists, battery, APU, INS alignment, then checking the checks. A ritual that used to ground him twisted into compulsion. He knew it and didn't stop. Control felt like oxygen. Night sorties ask more trust from your brain. The black outside the canopy flattens depth, and every star wants to masquerade as motion. He recited the vestibular illusions from training like an incantation. The leans, the Coriolis, the somatographic uptake. He knew the human body is a bad instrument at night. He told himself to fly the jet, not the body. But the body had opinions now. On catapult, his breathing drill marched. In 6, hold 2 out 6. The shot threw the carrier behind him and delivered the familiar shove. He scanned, attitude, altitude, airspeed, cross-checked the standbys. Everything was right and still wrong. He caught himself giving altitude a second glance, then a third. The habit became a loop. They pushed toward the range under a moon that rubbed the ocean smooth. Stars crowded the canopy, and he caught false movement in the periphery. Each time, a quick eye flick brought the sky back to still. He didn't say anything on the radio. The air-to-air channel had become a place where silence felt safer than small confessions. He built a bubble around himself, airspeed anchored to a number, altitude pinned, heading nailed. He'd always flown with a little jazz, a touch of swing in the inputs. Tonight, he flew like a metronome. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying not to fail, and that's when jets start to feel like strangers. On the break back to the boat, he felt tremor in his hands. Not the big shake of panic. A micro-vibration that transmitted through the stick like Morse code. He flexed, released, flexed again. The groove looked perfect. Lineup lights steady. Ball on. He rolled into the trap picture and felt his fingers miss a beat on the throttle. The jet dipped a hair low, and the LSO's voice cut. Power. He added, caught it, and then a thought slid in. Don't be that pilot who saves low too late. He punched it off. Bolter. He told himself it was the safe call. The paddles offered a calm, come again. He turned downwind, angry at his hands. In the ready room after, the jokes came light and quick. You sightseeing? You fall in love with the ball? Harmless, except the edges had changed. Behind the grin, he heard the whispered version in the hallway. He's spooked. Call sign jokes surfaced with a new vinegar. He laughed along because he knew the rules. You don't ask for gravity to lighten. Back in the rack, sleep fractured again. He woke at 4:07 and watched the glow from a bulkhead light paint a thin line across the ceiling, a false horizon. He practiced EMDR-style bilateral tapping he'd read about in some base flyer, left, right, trying to settle the images. He told himself he'd try therapy. He knew the stigma on base. You go to mental health is how careers get rerouted. He chose quiet endurance. It felt like discipline. It was isolation. He started to add small, private rituals to pre-flight. Tap the canopy rail twice. Touch the compass card. Whisper the tail number. Pilots love routine, but he could feel the line between good ritual and superstition blurring. He crossed it anyway. Anything to shrink the margin where doubt lived. The hypervigilance didn't clock out. Scans ran on a loop even when nothing moved, and his brain flagged every flicker as threat. On the next night hop, the stars slid again. He forced himself to say it aloud on interflight. Check illusions. The lead answered with a neutral 2, not acknowledging, not denying. He understood the favor. The silence protected both of them. In the stack, he watched the boat turn upwind, the wake a bright scene. He noticed how his shoulders had crept up toward his ears. He dropped them by force. He pictured the object at the wave tops, how the water hadn't pleaded with physics, how stillness had felt like a dare. The thought arrived uninvited and pulled at his hands. He reset the scan and reminded himself, fly the needles. He landed clean. The LSO gave him a fare he would have turned down weeks ago. He took it and kept walking. The deck crew's gestures looked louder tonight. Every signal had extra edge, like the ship knew he needed clarity. He wanted someone to tell him he was fine. No one does that. Not for adults with wings. The squadron's group chat lit with a meme of a UFO beaming up a tanker. Harmless, except it landed on the wrong day. He thumbed a smiley face and put the phone face down. Humor had become the armored vehicle they all rode in to avoid the minefield. At home on leave, his wife asked why he'd been sleeping on the couch. He told her it was hot upstairs. She stared at him the way only someone who knows your tells can. You're not here when you're here, she said. He made coffee at 9 at night, a stall tactic. He looked up articles about sleep hygiene, military fatigue, UAP hearings he pretended not to follow. He increased his miles on the treadmill and told himself he was burning it out of his system. The miles didn't catch up. Back on base, he watched younger guys brief with casual confidence and felt old in a way that had nothing to do with birthdays. He started arriving earlier for briefs, sitting close to the door, an exit strategy that made no sense and helped anyway. Hypervigilance crept into the radio. 2, call sign acknowledgements came faster, check-ins sharper. Sudden radio calls banged through him like dropped pots. He masked it with a crisp, go ahead. He aborted another approach a week later. The lineup was fine, but his hands remembered the tremor and anticipated it, which is how tremors multiply. He waved early, safe, textbook. The paddles gave him the nod. He debriefed himself twice as hard, blamed nothing but his decisions, and still couldn't find the gear to flip the switch back. Therapy on base hovered like a mirage. He clicked the number and didn't dial. He pictured the paper trail, the whisper in medical, the way flight doc and temporary DNIF would pair up and stick. He chose to white-knuckle the next brief, then the next, then the one after that. Quiet endurance turned into quiet panic, one sortie at a time. He noticed how he'd started to sleep with his phone on loud, waiting for a call he wasn't sure he wanted. He noticed how the pantry light triggered a small startle when it clicked. When he drove under an overpass, his chest tightened as if the concrete was about to come down. The body keeps notes the mind tries to ignore. He labeled the symptoms because labels shrink monsters. Startle response, anticipatory anxiety, avoidance. each one a breadcrumb he could follow back out. Meanwhile, the tape had started to grow legs. A clip on a training reel found its way into the wrong ready room. Laughter followed it, then quiet, then questions. He heard about it secondhand and felt his stomach drop. He still hadn't said the real words to anyone except the intel officer. The hangar had said them for him. He finally asked the flight doc for a sleep aid. The doc asked questions with the careful tone of someone sweeping for landmines. Any intrusive thoughts? Only at night, he said, aiming for light. Any panic in flight? No, he lied by omission. He left with a tiny bottle and a bigger problem. The images didn't wait for sleep. They spooled during quiet moments, a jump cut to wave top and silence where a boom should be. He started flying to not make mistakes. He flew perfect checklists, perfect calm, perfect procedures, and left no room for instinct. Everyone teaches you to fly by the book. No one tells you the book doesn't breathe for you. The most dangerous mindset isn't recklessness. It's fear of error, so complete you stop moving until the world moves you. The night he realized that, he sat in his car outside base housing and watched his hands on the wheel. They were steady. His chest felt like it held a radio squelch that wouldn't open. He whispered his own call sign to hear something normal. It sounded like a history he'd fallen out of. Meanwhile, the tapes kept walking into rooms he didn't control. And with each step, his silence got heavier. The tape and the leak. The first time the clip appeared on a training reel, it was supposed to be a throwaway, an example of don't trust a shaky lock. The projector hummed, the room smelled like old coffee and Nomex, and the frame popped up. Crosshairs hunting, objects sliding left without parallax, lock tone chirp, then break. Someone did the obligatory commentator voice. And here we see a rare species of weather balloon performing a lateral drag race. Laughter rolled, the kind that lets tension leave without admitting it arrived. But when the laughter died, no one reached for the remote. The frames hung there, and the room hung with them. A lieutenant paused the video and stepped closer like distance might unlock a secret. Back it up 5 seconds. The chirp. The break. The object's aspect refused to change. Another voice tried to puncture the moment. Coastal ducting can mess with your brain. A third voice quieter. Pods don't get seasick. He focused on his breathing and kept his face blank. Being the subject of a joke is levy work, you hold. After the brief, someone pulled stills off the reel. It wasn't malicious at first. Aviators collect anomalies like fishermen collect stories, proof for later. A JPEG on a thumb drive became a PNG in a folder. That became a crop sent in a private group chat. Lines got added, timestamp, bearing, altitude annotation. Someone sketched a little UFO emoji in the corner and deleted it, then posted. Anyway, by evening, a pseudonymous forum post blinked to life. Odd coastal anomaly. Anyone else seeing this behavior on at Fleur and Highshire? The clip wasn't attached, just 2 stills with the metadata shaved and a lot of caveats piled like sandbags. He read the post in bed on his phone and felt his stomach touch the floor. He wasn't tagged. Nobody said his name. It didn't matter. You always know when a story is yours. The wrong questions started arriving in the wrong order. A journalist he didn't know emailed from a burner address asking about recent range incursions and whether flight safety advisories had been issued. He hadn't told his wife why he'd started sleeping on the couch, only that the upstairs AC was on the fritz. She walked into the living room at 2 a.m., found him scrolling, and asked, "Are you mad at me or the ceiling?" He tried a smile. Neither. She stood there on the carpet, bare feet, waiting for a real answer. He didn't have one he could give. Operational security and emotional security collided, and one always loses. Back at the squadron, the XO held 5 minutes on information discipline. No finger-pointing, no threats, just a reminder that training material stays on the island. Everyone nodded. Afterward, in the hallway, a WSO said, "You can't keep toothpaste in a tube after it's in the toothbrush." The metaphor landed sideways and still made sense. He stared at his risk calculus like it was a math problem that kept changing variables. If he stayed silent and the story blew up later, he'd be branded a liar who had safety info. If he spoke now, the institution could decide he'd violated trust and make him the lesson. Clearance, pension, flight status, all of it was tied to discretion. He'd learned early that discretion wasn't silence, it was judgment. He also knew judgment is what people retroactively call luck. He drafted a note to his CO, deleted it, and started again. He asked for a closed door, no notes talk. The CO's eyebrow went up, then he gestured to the office and shut the door. What do you have? He laid it out. The clip on a training reel that shouldn't have traveled, the stills that had grown legs, the forum hint. He didn't accuse, didn't speculate, didn't flinch. He said, "I'm not talking to the press. I'm talking to you." The CO didn't lean back. He leaned forward, forearms on the desk, a posture that says engagement and caution. "You're right to bring it here. We'll handle the tape. We'll find the leak if there is one. You keep your circle small." The CO glanced at the wall where framed photos of change of command ceremonies stared back with fixed smiles. "And you keep flying." It sounded supportive. It also sounded like a directive to stay in the lane he'd already been told to stay in. He took a breath and added the part no one likes to say aloud. "Sir, range safety is compromised. We've got objects exhibiting non-compliant behavior inside training airspace. I recommend a safety advisory." The CO nodded once, slow. "I'll raise it up." The words mean everything and sometimes nothing. He could see the zipper of the bag the words would be placed in. He also saw the CO's jaw set. The man wasn't a villain. He was a custodian trying to keep the institution's floor dry during a storm. A day later, Public Affairs pinged the Squadron with the usual boilerplate. "All media inquiries go through PA, no comment on classified operational details. Safety remains the priority." He wasn't being singled out, but it had his name on it in invisible ink. He did exactly what he'd promised. He routed everything up and kept his mouth shut elsewhere. At home, the couch turned into a map of his nights. His wife finally asked the only question that mattered. "Are we safe?" It wasn't about aliens. It was about bills, futures, the scaffolding they'd built. He spoke carefully. "I'm doing everything by the book." She tilted her head. That wasn't the question. He looked at the ceiling again, because eye contact can be a truth serum. "I don't know yet." It was the most honest thing he'd said all month. She nodded, put a blanket over his legs, and went upstairs without slamming anything. Love is sometimes the sound of a door not closing hard. The next morning, a base legal officer stopped by the ready room with coffee in one hand and a pamphlet in the other. Friendly reminder about federal records, chain of custody, and retention. "If you see something you think is sensitive, don't make copies." He smiled like a dentist reminding you to floss after you've already lost a molar. He checked the @Fleur hard drive custody logs. They were clean. The training reel had been compiled from de-identified clips meant to illustrate sensor behavior, not tell a story. The leak, if it existed, was less a hole and more a seep, friction around the edges, human curiosity finding a path. He made a call he'd been avoiding, the one to his former instructor who'd seen a different weird years ago and paid for saying it. The man answered on the second ring. "You're late," he said, not unkindly. They didn't talk about objects or tapes. They talked about process. "Speak up internally early, before the rumor sets your narrative for you," the instructor said. "Use their words, our facts, and don't guess. Guessing is how they box you." He wrote it down like it was a checklist. He took his controlled disclosure higher, to a safety officer with more stripes and longer memory. He presented only verifiable details, timestamps, systems, chain of custody, the specific behavior of the pod's algorithm when presented with a zero-aspect lateral mover. He didn't say impossible. He said non-conforming. The safety officer listened and finally said, "We'll open a look, not an inquiry." He translated silently, fact-finding, not blame-finding. It was something and not enough. 2 days later, he saw a different machine wake up. An email with a serial number subject line, a list of recipients he didn't recognize, and a request for preservation of data. IT started imaging drives. Maintenance tagged a pod for audit. CIC got a visit from people who wore their badges on lanyards and used first names like last names. The ship felt the pressure drop before a storm. He watched the ready room quiet in a way he hadn't seen since a mishap years earlier. Jokes thinned. Eyes tracked who walked into the CO's office and how long they stayed. The tape had called the question, and now the question was answering back. He drove home that night through base housing, past bikes on lawns and a grill smoking in the dark. His phone buzzed with an unknown number. He didn't answer. He let it go to voicemail, then listened. "This is Name, with a national desk. We'd like to give you a chance to comment." He deleted it and turned the ringer off. He'd chosen his lane. The cost would arrive on its own schedule. He walked inside, sat on the couch, and didn't turn on the TV. The house was quiet. For the first time in weeks, his hands were steady. He'd made a decision. Tell the truth where it could be used, not where it could be sold. That decision would wake the investigation he thought he wanted, and show him the version of it he didn't. The investigation that wasn't. It started with a subject line that looked like a part number and felt like a warning. Not an inquiry, just a fact gathering. That was the phrase in the brief. Everyone heard, protect the institution. He walked into the conference room and saw the mix you get when systems feel threatened. Safety, intel, maintenance, IT, and one person who never introduced himself and didn't need to. They opened with weather. "Let's talk ducting profiles," said the staff meteorologist, already projecting SCUT logs. He nodded through the layers and wind fields he could recite in his sleep. They moved to training tempo. "How many sorties in the last 7 days? Any fatigue factors?" He answered the numbers and left his broken sleep out. The recorder whirred. The question skipped the object like a stone skipping water. Touch and go, never sinking. Chain of custody turned into a maze. "When did you hand the pod drive to maintenance? Who signed? Where was it stored?" He pointed at logs he knew were clean. IT spoke in their dialect. "We'll reimage and mirror for preservation." He'd heard that before, usually after mishaps. Drives got wiped and rebuilt for stability. He asked, "Will original images be retained?" The IT lead smiled a professional smile. "We preserve per policy." Policy was a fog bank, dense enough to hide anything and thin enough to see shapes you couldn't name. Down in the shop, the maintenance chief met him by the workbench with the look of a man who's had to keep 2 truths in his head at once. "Keep a copy of your notes," he said quietly, as if the hydraulic fluid might repeat him. He tapped the pocket where the spiral pad lived. "Accuracy," the chief added, "a word that covers courage when you can't say courage." Then a louder voice, "We're doing a pod audit." The room stiffened into official posture. He sat for another interview, this one run by safety. The tone was gentler and somehow sharper. "Walk us through your scan." He did, from the breathing drill to the brake lock. "Any spatial disorientation?" He kept his voice level. "No. Any startle?" "Negative." They wrote it down like it could be weighed. "Recommend actions?" "Range safety advisory, multi-sensor capture, training update." Pens moved, eyes didn't. He asked the question he knew would sour the air. "Is this being treated as a hazard to aviation?" A captain in khakis answered without moving his jaw. "We're scoping scope." It meant nothing and everything. He felt the room calibrate around the phrase. How far they could go without tripping a tripwire he couldn't see. Phone calls started coming at odd hours. A staffer from somewhere above the squadron rung him up with a tone that tried to be friendly and landed on rehearsed. "We're just trying to understand the context." He gave dates, times, sensor types, crew counts. When the voice asked, "Could this have been adversary drones?" he let the question sit, then answered, "Observed behavior inconsistent with known SUS performance in that environment." He heard the keyboard clicks. Boxes were being checked, and none of them said, "Listen to the pilot breathe." Back in CIC, operators fielded their own fact gatherings. The senior controller told him later over a lukewarm coffee, "They asked me if I'd ever seen angels." He'd smiled without teeth. "I said I've seen clutter and I've seen threats, and I don't confuse the two on days I like myself." The controller stared into his cup. They nodded like that means anything to a spreadsheet. He noticed the psychological toll looping. Hypervigilance had moved from the cockpit into hallways, stairwells, inboxes. A chair scraping in the ready room made him jump in his skin. A sudden radio call over base loudspeakers hit like a slap. He'd walked around combat zones calmer than he walked around his own squadron building this week. The body learns faster than the institution. He was called to a data review session where the FLIR footage should have been the centerpiece. Instead, a black screen greeted them, then a splash of test patterns, then the clip in a player with redacted metadata. "We're avoiding bias," someone said. The pod tried to lock, failed, tried again, exactly as he remembered. But the time stamps, the lat long, the lines that make memories argue less, had been smudged out. He raised a hand. "Can we view the full header?" A polite, "Not at this phase." Phases become walls when you need doors. He put in for a copy of his own interview recording. The admin smiled the way people do when they've been told to smile. "We'll get that through the proper channels." Proper channels are where urgency goes to nap. He walked out into the blinding noon and let the heat drive the chill out of his hands. On the 3rd day, he found a memo on his desk, "Flight Operations Limited pending review." The phrase wasn't DNIF, not officially. It kept him in uniform and on the schedule for everything that wasn't flying. It also took the jet out of his bloodstream with a single line. Identity cracks loudest in quiet rooms. He sat in one and listened to something inside him rearrange. An old friend from another squadron called after hearing a whisper through the network. "Heard you're in the barrel," the friend said, not unkindly. He asked if the friend had ever had drives get re-imaged during a look. The friend laughed once. "The best way to keep data safe is to replicate it. The second best is to say you did." They let the line go quiet. "You okay?" the friend asked. He lied because that's what you do when the true answer carries weight. "I'm good." In a corner office, a meeting he wasn't invited to, hammered out language he'd eventually read on a screen. No evidence of system malfunction. No conclusive identification of observed contact. No impact to mission readiness. It would look like closure and act like a curtain. He would feel both. He noticed who avoided his eyes and who didn't. The crew chief still handed him forms with the same steady hand. The EW officer stopped in a passageway and said, "I didn't see emissions. That doesn't mean there weren't any." It was the most honest sentence he'd heard all week. The intel officer passed him and offered a nod that didn't reach the eyes. Nod currency had devalued. That night he sat with his notes, the originals the chief told him to keep, and copied them in cleaner handwriting. He added nothing, subtracted nothing. He numbered pages, dated them, and slipped them into a manila envelope. He sealed it, then opened it back up to check, then sealed it again. Hypervigilance performs as thoroughness until it doesn't. He woke before dawn from a dream where the HUD blinked and would not stop. He walked the base track until the sun made the asphalt smell like rain. On the 7th lap, the word risk divided in his head. Risk to flight, risk to career, risk to truth. He couldn't protect all three. They called him back for one more clarification. The same room, the same hum. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" was the question that could be mercy or trap. He cleared his throat. "Yes. Treating these events as noise increases hazard. We should be collecting, not discouraging. I recommend codified reporting that protects crews." The pen paused. Someone shifted. Someone else coughed. The recorder whirred. When it was over, they thanked him for his professionalism. The door clicked shut behind him with the soft certainty of a filed document. He stood in the hallway and realized he'd tried to protect the team and the truth, and the team had chosen not to pick between them. Institutions survive by not choosing until they're forced to. Grounding created space. In that space, ghosts rushed in. The stillness against the wind, the drop without a boom, the laughter that wasn't laughter, the drive that might or might not exist anymore. He drove home under a sky that made promises it couldn't keep and tried to pretend the ground was steady. The investigation had awakened. It would prove to be the kind that carefully measures everything except what mattered. Life on the ground, when the jet leaves you. The day the flight limit memo hit, his morning ritual fell apart. No brief to make, no jet to pre-flight, no checklist cadence to keep his head from wandering into places it didn't want to go. He made coffee, didn't drink it, laced his shoes, and ran the base perimeter until his calves burned. He missed the weight of the helmet bag on his shoulder. Structure had always been his weatherproofing. Without the jet, the weather got in. He tried to fill the hours with errands, ID card renewal, supply runs, inbox zero, but time spilled through his hands. He walked into medical to push VA paperwork and found himself staring at boxes with phrases that felt like accusations. Adjustment disorder. Rule out PTSD. He checked none, then some, then scratched through the ink. The flight doc glanced up, waiting. He said, "Sleeps off." The doc wrote, "Insomnia situational," because naming things sideways is how you keep people flying. Except he wasn't flying. On the freeway home, he ducked under an overpass and everything clenched. The dark concrete slammed his peripheral vision, and his body decided it had been thrown into a black cockpit at 200 knots. Hands sweaty, forearms buzzing, heart up. He eased off the gas, took the next exit, and parked by a strip mall with a dry cleaner and a donut shop. He sat in silence and let his nervous system count down without asking permission. At home, his wife measured him with quiet. She placed her phone face down on the table, like a ceasefire flag. "You're here but not here," she said, "second time this week, third time this month." He nodded and tried honesty in small spoonfuls. "I'm grounded." Her mouth pressed thin. "For how long?" He shrugged, which is a way of saying you don't control your life. "Pending review." She asked the only practical question. "Do we need to worry?" He wanted to promise. He settled for, "I don't know." Night stretched the hours like rubber. The ceiling fan sounded like a bad bearing. He lay on the couch, scrolling past articles about UAP hearings he pretended not to read, and slid into research tunnels that promised answers if he just kept digging. He watched grainy declassified clips and learned nothing he didn't already know in his bones. Objects with no obvious propulsion, right-angle turns, speeds that laugh at air. His kid padded down the hall at dawn, hair sticking out like the world had surprised him. Why do planes make you sad now? The question landed clean. He swallowed, forced the simplest truth. Sometimes they make me miss things. The kid nodded with that child's acceptance and asked about pancakes. Ordinary requests are lifelines. The household choreography shifted. He did school drop-off, picked up groceries, fixed the hinge that had squeaked for a year. He completed tasks and felt none of the lift he used to get from putting a jet down on a deck in weather. The difference wasn't pride. It was purpose. A landing graded okay meant something in a way a repaired hinge didn't. He hated himself for thinking that, then hated the hate. He stopped by the base gym at odd hours to avoid conversation, and found himself among two other ghosts, aviators with the same 1,000-yard focus on the treadmill. He recognized one from a different air wing. They nodded like guys who've forgotten how to say hello. Later in the locker room, the man tied his shoes and said without looking up, "You ever see something you weren't supposed to?" He didn't answer. The man added, "I did." Then he stood and left. That was the entire exchange, and it was enough to break a seal. He pulled numbers from old phones and started dialing. A Navy friend who'd flown off the East Coast. An Air Force pilot who'd worked a Western training range. The first call lasted 6 minutes. The second, 40. They talked around it at first, weather, kids, hardware upgrades. Then the story surfaced, held against a crosswind like it had nails in the sky. Pod refused to settle, like the target didn't have edges. Range control told us to ignore it and continue, and I felt stupid pressing into something I couldn't name. There was shame baked into every sentence, the shame of competent people having their competence pulled like a rug. He kept notes, careful as a court reporter. Dates, ranges, sensor types, crew positions. He cut out the speculation and left only behaviors. He started to see a pattern run straight through the anecdotes like wire. Non-compliant intrusions inside training airspace, variable altitudes, intermittent skin paint, at FLIR aberrations that lined up across squadrons. It wasn't proof of anything except that crews were encountering something they couldn't categorize and were discouraged from naming. He set an appointment with a counselor off base, paid cash, and sat in a room with a cheap sound machine pretending to be rain. "I need to be able to walk under an overpass without thinking my cockpit's collapsing," he said. The counselor nodded and asked him to follow her fingers left, right, left, right. EMDR felt silly until it didn't. The drop replayed, the stillness returned, and then in a thin, fragile way, the image lost a millimeter of power. He left exhausted and a shade lighter. For the first time, the memory blinked before he did. A tiny proof the brain could be retrained. On weekends, he took his kid to a park under the departure corridor. A C-17 climbed shallow, engines drawing a rectangle in the air. He braced for the surge he'd been carrying and found only a small ache. Progress measured in breaths. He stood there, hands in pockets, and realized he could watch without checking fuel states in his head. That was new. The marriage found a careful truce. Honesty got traded in increments. "I'm scared of losing what I am," he said over dishes. "What are you?" she asked. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Later he tried again. "I'm a pilot." She shook her head. "You're more than that." He believed her and didn't, both at once. Identity is a superstition you repeat until it works. Losing the cockpit felt like an amputation with ghost pain. He could still feel the throttle in a hand that no longer held it. He wrote a letter he didn't send. It outlined a reporting process that protected crews. Auto-preservation of sensor data, anonymous safety channels, no career penalties for filling out a form that used the word UAP. He CC'd nobody and saved it to a folder named Later. Then he made the call that mattered most. He reached out to a former skeptic he respected, the one who'd once joked that UFO stories were just bad radar and worse coffee. The man picked up, listened to the sketch, and went quiet. "We had a cube in a sphere," he said finally, voice flat. "Sat on the nose like a threat. We filed it as training interference, and I hated myself for the words." He didn't press. He just said, "I'm putting names to timelines." No press. Safety. The man exhaled. "Send me the format. I'll give you what I can confirm." He organized a small, private call with 3 pilots from 2 services. No adjectives, no theories. They spoke in the language of operators, altitudes, vectors, failures that weren't failures. After an hour, someone said, "We should have had this talk in 2015. He wrote a line in his notebook. The pattern is bigger than one man. He looked at it until the words felt like a plan. On a Tuesday, he parked near a small municipal airfield and cracked the windows. A trainer did circuits, low and slow, the engine note steady as a metronome. He waited for his chest to knot. It didn't. He counted 10 breaths, then 10 more. Progress wasn't a graduation. It was a series of non-events that add up. He drove home with a decision clicking into place. He wasn't going back to the jet had gone on without him. But he could protect the next crew from carrying this alone. He would pick up the phone, and he would keep the record clean. He would trade the cockpit for the paper trail and learn to live with the ground. The others, patterns across squadrons. The first call that really broke open the map came from an East Coast Navy aviator who didn't waste breath on preamble. We saw them off the training boxes. Same behavior, holding in wind that would drag a kite sideways. He listed altitudes like he was reading a receipt. Angels 22, Angels 30, then wave top. Pod went hunting, never found an edge. The cadence matched what was in his own notebook. Different range, same script. A week later, an Air Force pilot from a western range drew the same shape with different words. Radar skin would appear, disappear, reappear 30 miles away within a sweep. We scrubbed the AP models, didn't fit. He hesitated, then added, "We got told to continue training and not burn gas on air unknowns." He didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. The phrase had the same weight in every service. Conversations stacked into a kind of choir. A Marine WSO described a drop from mid-20s to the deck in a blink. "I waited for the boom, brother. All I got was my own heartbeat." An instructor from a guard unit recounted a night flight where the stars felt like they were moving until one of them moved wrong. That Fleur tried to lock. Crosshairs slid like they were on ice. He asked about recalibrations. We did them. Pod checked out. We checked out. The world didn't. Patterns formed where stories overlapped. Training ranges intruded. Sensor discord that wasn't discord so much as the sensors agreeing on something they couldn't hold. At Fleur's refusing to bite. Spy or equivalent radar calling skin paint intermittent. Each time, the language curved away from certainty and settled on phrases you could defend in a memo. He wasn't chasing proof of origin. He was mapping a safety hazard nobody was allowed to name. He started collecting the institutional echoes too. One Navy squadron had filed a safety memo years back, the kind that mentioned range incursions, without accusing the wind. It read like a Ryan Graves brief stripped of headlines, all business. Avoid vectors that put crews nose to nose with unknowns, document chain of custody, preserve sensor captures. The memo lived in a dusty shared drive, and still quietly taught anyone who found it how to survive a subject that makes careers tense. He found near-miss accounts that hadn't made it through the public door. A Super Hornet had an object flash across its nose inside a mile. No transponder, no boom, nothing but a trail of tightened muscles in the cockpit. A training flight out of a different coast had to break off a run because the ATC picture showed a target that wasn't on the NOTAMs. Controller tone went careful, the pilot said, which is the phrase everyone used for the way professionals talk when they're standing on one foot between reality and their guidance. Not every voice came in calm. A former skeptic, a guy who'd once run the table on bar bets about UFOs, took a long pause mid-call, then said it like he'd been holding his breath for years. Cubanosphere, gray inside a translucent shell, sat in front of me at altitude like it wanted to be counted. He cleared his throat and added, almost embarrassed, "We logged it as training interference." I kept my job. I lost sleep. Pick your poison. He wrote that down verbatim, then underlined it and didn't know why. He asked a lawyer he trusted where the edges were. If crews want to speak, what's the channel that doesn't eat them? The attorney didn't reach for courage. He reached for statute. There are IG paths, whistleblower protections, and congressional lanes. All real. All with teeth that bite both ways if you step wrong. He translated that to mean, be exact, be narrow, and keep receipts. Speculation is a cliff, facts are stairs. The lawyer repeated it like a creed. Speak carefully. He started to build a document trail that could survive being read by people who didn't want to believe it and people who wanted to believe too much. Declassified synopses became anchors. The Nimitz contacts, the gimbal footage with the steady wind layer reference, the go-fast track that played optical illusions against ocean skim. Allies had their own entries, Canada's aviation reports with odd intrusions, Chile's long-archived FLIR clip with behavior that misbehaved politely, Japan's requests for UAP reporting guidance. He didn't wave them around like totems. He set them next to the operator accounts and let the alignments do their quiet work. What nobody knew at the time, he wrote in the margins, was how many of these events were being handled as if they were PR problems, not safety stories. A controller in one of those conversations told him, "We lack a code for unknown that violates air behavior, so we use the codes we have." He read that twice. Systems force reality into boxes. When reality doesn't fit, the corners cut skin. He kept a tally of common signatures without pretending they added up to a logo. Instant acceleration without the courtesy of a shock wave, right-angle vector changes that would jelly a pilot, holds against high winds, transmedium hints like radar returns from sea surface up to flight levels inside one sweep. He wanted to write impossible. He wrote non-conforming. He could feel his language getting policed from the inside now, long before it met anyone else's red pen. He added a column for consequences. A Navy flyer DNIF'd pending review for weeks after an honest write-up. An Air Force crew got quietly reassigned to ground duties, their evals stamped with needs supervision, but no cause. One Marine got the opposite. Quiet support from a CO who understood that telling the truth is not a performance issue. Outcomes varied with leadership, not evidence. He didn't like that column. He needed it. Meanwhile, he started drafting testimony formats with holes where adjectives would normally live. Dates, times, altitudes, sensor types, crew positions, chain of custody specifics. He ran it past a mentor who'd seen hearings from the inside. The man circled 2 words. No theories. He agreed. Theories were fireworks. Facts were fuses. He needed fuses. He rehearsed saying, "I don't know," and meant it. He'd learned that, "I don't know," is not an admission of weakness when the next sentence is strong. Here's what we recorded is strong. Here's how our safety systems currently fail to protect crews when they report this is stronger. He stripped every sentence of romance. He kept the human where it mattered. Because behind the acronyms and careful phrasing were people like him, recalibrating their sleep and their faces after ready room jokes. One pilot told him his kid had asked why planes made him sad now, and he'd said, "They don't," then gone outside to breathe air that wasn't recycled. He recognized the posture. He'd worn it. He felt the edge of a decision come into focus. He wasn't building a case for what these things are. He was building a case for how to act when you meet one. Treat it as a safety issue, not an embarrassment. That meant codified reporting, sensor preservation, leadership that didn't punish the word UAP when it appeared on a line. It also meant someone had to put their own name where others had given him theirs. He drafted the first page of his testimony and removed everything that reached. Facts. No metaphors. No claims that would make a headline easy. He called 3 of the voices back and asked permission to reference behaviors without attribution. They said yes, with the condition every operator asks for. Don't make us the story. He promised. He meant it. He looked at his manila envelope of notes, and at the phone he'd used to stitch together a pattern across squadrons. The line he'd written days ago stared back at him. The pattern is bigger than one man. He finally let the second sentence arrive, so speak like it. He closed the folder, stood, and knew the cost would start counting as soon as he opened his mouth. The hearing that didn't save him. They booked him into a windowless room 3 floors below the flags, a place that smelled like paper and old carpet cleaner. Not a spectacle, no microphones with logos, no lights, just a closed-door brief with staffers who'd been handed a mandate and a time slot. He laid his folder on the table and introduced himself without adjectives. They nodded, clicked pens, and asked him to start at the beginning. He didn't. He started where it mattered: dates, locations, sensor types, crew counts. He spoke like he'd practiced, no theories, no metaphors. At FLIR on a Super Hornet, crosshairs unable to maintain lock on a stationary contact relative to 120 knot winds. Brake lock events matched radar returns labeled skin paint intermittent by shipboard spy. A staffer wrote fast, then slowed. What altitude bands? 24,000 to wave top in under a second, no acoustic signature. He watched a brow lift, then settle. Can you show the chain of custody? A lawyer asked without looking up. He slid a list across, drive serials, timestamps, signatures, the points where IT had mirrored data. We were told drives were re-imaged for stability. Original images preserved per policy. He used their words. because that's how you stay inside the lines and still say something. A younger staffer leaned forward. Are you sure this wasn't drones? He met the question and didn't flinch. Observed lateral and vertical performance exceeded known SUS capabilities in that environment. No associated emissions detected by EW. No visual propulsion. Behavior inconsistent with balloon drift, clutter, or birds. The staffer tapped a pen. Could this be spoofing? He shook his head once. At Fleur's passive IR. Spoofing the ship doesn't change the pod seeing a heat profile the software can't hold. They exchanged a look that said, we'll check. He stuck to verifiable details. He laid out the sequence. Intercept brief, controller call, objects hold against the wind, drop to the deck, pods failed lock, the debrief where language got sanded, the internal leak, the fact gathering that smudged metadata, the flight limit memo. He did not tell them what it felt like to abort a perfect trap because his hands shook. He did not tell them about the overpass panic. Feelings weren't currency in this room. Receipts were. A staffer with gray at the temples asked the safety question that actually mattered. Were range safety protocols adequate? He answered with the sentence he'd written in his notebook at 3 a.m. No. We lacked a codified, protected reporting mechanism that preserves sensor data automatically and shields crews from career penalty when they report non-compliant unknowns in training airspace. Head stopped. Eyes lifted. The room held a second of air that felt honest. He offered his small stack of declassified anchors, not as proof of origin, but as proof of pattern. Nimitz contacts logged, Gimbal with wind layer references, go-fast illusion math, allied reports from Canada and Chile that mirrored behaviors. These show repeated safety anomalies. My testimony fills in the operator side. He didn't say the word phenomenon. He said hazard. The shift mattered. One staffer closed a binder and asked, almost softly, "Did you feel threatened?" He watched the trap open and kept his foot back. A collision risk existed. That landed where it needed to. Inside policy language, outside sensationalism. Another staffer whispered without looking up, "You did the right thing." Then she stood, slipped out, and let the door click, a quiet mercy he'd remember later when he needed to. The hour turned into 90 minutes. Questions circled back. Weather, fatigue, training tempo, sensor maintenance, IG options. "Why not go public?" a comms aide asked. He shook his head. "I'm not the story. Safety is. Public heat without internal structure cooks crews." She watched him for signs of ambition and found none. He was careful. With names. He did not expose wingmen, controllers, techs. He referenced behaviors, dates, and roles. When they pressed for identities, he offered to connect staff with operators off the record under counsel. The lawyer nodded. "We'll use IG lanes." He breathed once slow. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a path that had fences. Then the question he couldn't dodge arrived, wrapped in innocuous phrasing. "Does your command support your continued flight status?" He felt the floor tilt a degree. "My status is flight limited pending review." The younger staffer frowned. "For reporting safety issues?" He didn't answer the implication. Pending review. They asked about the leak. He told them the sequence and said he'd chosen controlled disclosure to superiors, not the press. He did not call it a leak himself. He said, unauthorized redistribution of a training clip. Words matter when you're trying not to be turned into a headline. They asked what he wanted. He kept it small, protected reporting, auto-preservation, training updates to avoid nose-to-nose with unknowns. This isn't disclosure theology. It's air safety. The gray-templed staffer smirked, not unkindly. "You'll make no friends with that line, and also the right ones." He nodded. Right friends didn't keep you flying, but they kept you sane. When the session ended, hands shook over the table. The lawyer gathered his copies and passed them back. "We can't keep these." He understood. He had them scanned, time-stamped, preserved in ways that would hold in rooms like this, and in rooms colder. He stepped into the corridor bright with fluorescent ambition and blind corners, and an aide caught up to him near the elevators. "Media's waiting outside," she said low. "They know there were briefings. Don't engage." He smiled a small, tired smile. "I came here to avoid that." The doors opened. He left 3 floors up and 1 world down. Outside, cameras waited by the curb, the way they do when rumor outruns paperwork. A voice called his name, first, last rank. He kept walking. "Can you confirm objects in training ranges?" No comment. Another question. "Are these adversary systems?" No comment. "Are you still flying?" He did not answer. He wasn't going to become the story and feed a narrative he didn't own. Back at the squadron, a thin letter sat on his desk like a blade in an envelope. Mission readiness review complete. He unfolded it and read the line twice to confirm the math. For the safety of crew and mission, flight status is permanently revoked. No drama, no moral. Just 7 words that took the jet out of his bloodstream and left the uniform behind. He didn't throw the letter. He didn't swear. He sat. He placed it flat on the desk, smoothed the crease, and felt an odd quiet arrive. The XO stepped in, shut the door, and didn't sit. "This came from above," he said, eyes steady. "I argued readiness. They cited risk." He nodded once, because the sentence had done its work already. The XO slid a second page across. "We'll find you a seat that matters." It was kind. It was also airless. News didn't travel by memo. It moved through a building by eye contact and silences. The crew chief caught his glance on the line and looked away, then back, then offered a nod that felt like a salute with the hand cut off. A WSO clapped his shoulder and said nothing. That was the right thing to say. He walked out to the edge of the ramp where the smell of fuel and hot brakes usually felt like home. A jet taxied past, canopy down, pilot's head on a swivel, the world reduced to a set of needles and numbers. He watched it roll and knew the door had closed. He'd kept the record clean, and the system had kept itself cleaner. He folded the letter, slid it into the folder with his notes, and headed for the parking lot. The hearing had treated safety like a subject, not a spectacle. It hadn't saved his wings. The cost he'd tallied in pencil was now ink. The final warning. The envelope was government thin, the kind that makes every corner feel sharp. He already knew the line inside because he'd learned to hear sentences before he read them. For the safety of crew and mission, you will not return to flight. It read like a checklist item. It felt like a verdict. He stood in the office long enough for the fluorescent hum to become a clock. He took the paper to an empty ready room and set it on the table, flat, top left aligned with the wood grain like alignment could return control. His eyes drifted to the framed photos on the wall. Patch ceremonies, cruise books, jets in formation over carriers at dawn. When he looked back, the sentence hadn't softened. He didn't pace. He didn't call anyone. He pulled out his notes, slid the letter beneath them, and sat with the weight of both. A young crew chief poked his head in, recognized the privacy, and retreated with a gentle nod. The base has a way of knowing when not to add a sound. Memory has its own radio. The object came back as if it had been waiting in the ceiling tiles, hovering at 24,000 like it had discovered a button labeled pause, in winds that would drag anything with a surface sideways. He could hear the controller's careful voice again, the pod chirping its small alarms, his own brake lock catching on the way out of his throat. The drop to the wavetop played in slow motion, which is how fast the past moves when it wants to stay. He held the letter a second time and noticed the grammar. No accusation, no failure assigned, no misconduct implied. Safety language. It removed him from the equation the way a surgeon cuts around healthy tissue, precise, dispassionate, complete. He respected safety. He also felt erased by it. Both things sat in the room without arguing. The XO had done what he could. He delivered the paper with the kind of steady tone that keeps rooms from shaking. "You'll have options," he'd said, and meant staff billets, training roles, a desk that called itself a cockpit when it needed to. Options are not choices when the thing you choose has already chosen you back. He signed the acknowledgement because the process requires a signature, and because saying no to gravity doesn't stop the fall. The pen didn't tremble. For the first time in months, his hands were steady. Acceptance is a kind of stillness that looks like resignation from the outside and feels like oxygen from the inside. He let it in. He walked the passageway slow, stopping where the ramp view cuts a bright rectangle into the building. A jet rolled, nose wheel straight, wingtip lights blinking through heat shimmer. He tracked it without envy, without anger. What he felt was smaller and more durable. The duty had moved, and he had to follow it. He thought about what the letter didn't say. It didn't accuse him of embellishing. It didn't question the gear. It didn't claim misperception. It simply set a boundary around risk and placed him on the safe side of it. Safe for them, not for him. He wouldn't get to test whether the tremor in his hands had learned its lesson. He wouldn't get the chance to make a clean pass in weather and call the paddles for a grade he could pin to his wall. He'd lost the future he used to envision on long flights, the one where he aged into teaching the groove to kids who thought they'd invented it. Meaning doesn't arrive as a speech. It shows up as a single sentence that won't leave. The warning wasn't aimed at him. It pointed outward, past the ramp, past the range boxes, into the airspace where unknowns behaved like they owned a carve-out in physics and paperwork pretended otherwise. The warning said, if crews keep meeting this and keep writing around it, the risk will keep hiding behind polite language. Pilots will continue to fly nose to nose with a hazard that has no section in the manual. He pulled the manila envelope of notes and added the letter to the back, a new last page. He wrote a small line on a sticky note and stuck it to the cover. Treat the record like fuel. He'd learned to preserve data because memory is a generous liar and institutions are efficient forgetters. He'd learned to strip adjectives because excitement becomes a weapon when you hand it to people who want you loud and wrong. He'd learned to hold the human steady while the facts did their work, because without the human it's an exercise, not a story. He called the safety officer who'd listened fairly when things were still in play. It's official, he said. The officer didn't offer platitudes. Understood. Then, after a beat, what do you need? He was surprised to hear himself answer without pause. A path to make reporting automatic and protected, and training that treats these as air hazards. The officer exhaled into the phone like a man measuring the length of a runway. We can draft. It'll take a coalition. He said, I know. Coalitions are slow. They're also the only structures that outlast a flight. Schedule. He sent a note to the pilot who'd described the cube in a sphere. I lost the jet, he wrote. The reply came fast. You didn't lose the truth. It wasn't a cure. It was a hand on a shoulder. He saved it. Validation landed where training couldn't, on the part of him that needed permission to move forward. He met with a small group in a windowless base conference room where the carpet had the pattern all base carpets have. They outlined a reporting flow that didn't require courage to use. Automatic sensor capture during encounters. Unredacted metadata preserved in a vault that's safety, not intel, keys. Anonymous safety submissions that route to a shielded inbox. A standing instruction that the word UAP in a log triggers preservation, not suspicion. They kept the language boring on purpose. Boring is how policy survives. He wrote to a congressional staffer he trusted from the briefing. He didn't ask for a hero's welcome. He asked for a pilot's safeguard. We need a mandate that treats these encounters as air safety events, not mysteries. That means data preservation by default and career protection for crews who file. The reply took a week and said what replies say when they're careful. We're exploring frameworks. He logged it, not as victory but as momentum. At home, he told his wife he was done bargaining with a cockpit that no longer had his name on it. He laid out the new mission without fanfare. I'm going to work the safety side, he said. She studied his face for the tremor she'd been pretending not to see. It wasn't there. Okay, she said, and in the space after that word he felt the house take a deeper breath. He drove to a small airfield the next Saturday and parked on the fence line. A trainer rotated and climbed, wheels tucking, engine note steady. He let his eyes follow it up and up, not as someone who'd be there again, but as someone who could keep people there safer. The difference hurt and didn't. He counted 10 breaths, then 10 more. He started answering calls he'd dodged. He told operators he'd protect their names and only carry their behaviors into rooms that can change things. He set up a quiet network for reporting, a bridge between crews and the few offices that wanted facts more than headlines. When a young pilot asked, "Will this save my wings?" he didn't lie. "It'll help save your skin. The wings are leadership." At night, he opened the envelope and reread the sentence on the letter the way you study a weather chart before walking out to the line. For the safety of crew and mission, you will not return to flight. He let himself hear the part he could use and ignored the part that wanted to bruise. The warning had been delivered to a person. He was going to deliver it to a system. He closed the envelope, turned off the lamp, and felt the day settle without the old squelch in his chest. He couldn't fly the jet. He could make sure the next pilot who met stillness in 100-knot wind had a way to say so without losing the sky. He'd redirected the vector. Purpose held. The global map of incidents. To see where his story fits, you have to zoom out. The dots were already on the map. Nimitz off Southern California in 2004, Gimbal and Go Fast off the East Coast years later, each one stamped into public memory by declassified clips and terse Navy confirmations. He laid his notes beside those cases and saw the same hand behind them. Objects holding in high winds, sudden vector changes that ignored inertia, sensors agreeing and still failing to cage the thing they were trying to measure. Start with Nimitz. Spy, one screen's tracked fast movers, controllers called merge plot, and aviators found a tic-tac falling from altitude to near the water with no sonic signature and no wake. Behavior he recognized like a scar. The pilot accounts described it pivoting without banking, then vanishing and reappearing miles away. In his notebook, he underlined a phrase he'd heard 3 times from different voices. It didn't fly, it moved. Shift to the gimbal event. The wind layer on the tape is steady. The object's aspect refuses to play by the pod's expectations. At FLIR hunts, crosshairs dance, gimbal roll does what gimbal roll does, and yet the lateral motion remains stubborn. Crew chatter lands somewhere between professional curiosity and a laugh that doesn't want to be a laugh. He'd lived that tone. There's a whole fleet of them. Someone says on the audio, not a claim of origin, a statement of a radar picture. Go Fast added another piece. A target low over the water that looks like it's screaming, until the geometry shows a smaller velocity than your eyes swear. Optical illusions stripped away, a stubborn residue remains. The sensor fought to hold an edge on something slipping outside the model. He'd watched his own pod do that, the way a dog's paws slide on tile while the body still tries to run. Allies had their entries. Canada's aviation reports quietly noted unknowns intruding where scheduled traffic shouldn't be, controllers choosing safety, while paperwork settled for vague. Chile's long-circulated FLIR case showed a target with thermal behavior that wouldn't collapse under simple explanations, analysis bouncing between prosaic and not prosaic and never landing clean. Japan asked its crews to start logging UAP to standardize safety reporting, not to chase mysteries, but to keep metal from meeting metal by surprise. He added civilian airspace because safety doesn't salute. A commercial pilot at cruise altitude turned back after a luminous sphere held nose on long enough to trigger the math nobody says out loud. Fuel, alternate, passengers, risk. The captain logged it with sober words and took the conservative door. He recognized the calculus because he'd lived it in a different uniform. Common signatures stacked. Instant acceleration without shock. Acute angle changes that would punish any airframe, holds against high winds, transmedium hints where returns stitched from sea skin to flight levels without turbulence in the data. Radar spoofing doesn't explain passive IR. Balloons don't knife sideways through shear. Drones at scale don't show up like this across decades and doctrines without leaving debris, telemetry, or bragging rights. Meanwhile, the institutional tension was global. Defense secrecy wants to protect methods and missions. Aviation safety wants sunlight and standardized checklists. He didn't need to resolve the tug of war to see where it snapped lines. When encounters get treated as intelligence curiosities first, safety reporting arrives second, and second is late when 2 aircraft share one sky. His own story slotted in without stretching. Intermittent skin paint? Nimitz had it. At FLIR that won't hold aspect? Gimbal made it public. Rapid displacement between radar sweeps? Controllers in his inbox had scribbled the same frustration in different time zones. He wasn't an outlier. He was a data point in a pattern that spanned languages, services, and coastlines. He started framing it in words that rooms full of pilots and bureaucrats could share without rolling their eyes. Range intrusions, non-compliant unknowns, hazard to aviation. The map wasn't a UFO poster. It was a safety chart with gaps where a legend should be. Every dot represented a crew doing math in real time, while the manuals stayed quiet. He wrote one more sentence in his notes and circled it. Treat the behavior, not the belief. You don't have to know what it is to know how to keep distance, to preserve data, to warn the next flight in. He'd lost the jet, but not the skill of turning chaos into checklists. The global picture gave him permission to keep the scope wide and the language narrow. To close the loop, he turned the map back into a single person again. The man who won't fly. His account wasn't a cliffhanger. It was a piece of a worldwide safety anomaly begging to be treated like weather. Named, tracked, briefed, respected. He took a breath and prepared to say it out loud in the only way that might move a system. Plainly, with receipts. Aftermath, a life rebuilt without the jet. He woke without an alarm and didn't know what to do with the quiet. No pre-flight. No brief. No jet waiting for hands that knew it better than they knew most people. He laced his shoes and ran before sunrise until his lungs found a rhythm. Morning runs replaced the smell of JP5. Cadence replaced checklist cadence. It wasn't flight, but it was structure, and structure kept the day from sliding. Therapy started to land, because he let it. EMDR felt like tapping at first, left, right, until the drop replayed and lost a fraction of its grip. He described the stillness in high wind, the pod that hunted edges and found none, the way a letter can end a life without a funeral. The counselor kept him inside the moment and then let him walk out of it. He left each session wrung out and a fraction lighter. He joined a peer group off base, aviators from different services who'd been benched by injuries, mishaps, or the slow grind of time. They didn't trade ghost stories. They traded habits. One showed him how to stack small wins at the start of a day, make the bed, drink water, touch daylight. Another gave him a line he wrote down. "You're not your flight hours." He wanted to argue. He didn't. The group normalized what the ready room punished, saying out loud that your brain can lag behind your body. At home, the marriage started to mend along the same small axis. He stopped editing his sentences. "I'm angry," he said one night. "At who?" she asked. "The sky," he said, and they both smiled because it sounded ridiculous and was honest. He told her about the overpass panic without pretending it was a fluke. She sat beside him on the couch, leaned her head against his shoulder, and said, "Then we drive the surface streets until you want the freeway again." It wasn't therapy. It was partnership doing its work. He built new rituals that echoed. The old ones without copying them. Morning runs. Coffee he actually drank. 10 minutes of breath work that wasn't about surviving a cat shot, but about lowering the static in his chest. A notebook on the kitchen table where he wrote 3 sentences each day. Something he was grateful for, something he learned, something he'd do for someone else. It sounded like a base pamphlet until it worked. He began mentoring quietly, off the record and off the base network. A pilot he'd never met sent a cautious message through a mutual friend. "I think I saw one." He set ground rules before they spoke. No theories. We talk behavior. We document. We protect each other. They spent an hour building a clean record, dates, altitudes, sensors, chain of custody. He repeated the phrase he wished someone had said to him the day after his first sighting. "You're not crazy. You're a witness. Keep receipts." Naming the fear took away its camouflage. Procedure gave it a box to live in. He took 2 younger aviators to breakfast at a diner near the airfield. He let them ask what they were scared to ask in a ready room. "Will reporting it kill our careers?" one said. He didn't flinch. "The risk is real. So is the hazard. If you see something that can hurt crews, you file. We'll route it right." He slid a 1-page template across the table. Plain language, no adjectives, boxes for sensor specifics, and chain of custody. This keeps you factual. It also signals to safety that this isn't gossip. One of them traced a finger over the line that read, "UAP behavior, non-compliant with known aircraft or natural phenomena expectations." Boring language by design. Boring survives. He tested himself in small ways. He parked near an airfield and watched a trainer practice touch and goes. The first time, his hands found the steering wheel like a lifeline. The second time, he leaned back. The third time, he timed his breath to the downwind, base, final, and realized he was tracking grace, not danger. Progress measured in breaths. He set up a standing call with the safety officer from his old command, and 2 others who dealt with weird without burning down careers. They built steps instead of speeches. Automatic sensor preservation when UAP flags in a log. A safety run vault for raw data with unredacted metadata. An anonymous reporting lane that routes through safety first, intel second. Training slides that treat unknowns like weather. Behavior to avoid, distances to keep, procedures to follow. He drafted memos written in the dialect bureaucracy respects. References, bullet points, no verbs that imply belief. He knew the difference between movement and momentum. He wanted both. At night, he read outside the headlines. Aviation incident digests. Human factors research. Case studies from Chile, Japan, Canada. Places where air safety and defense secrecy compromise in public. He built a file of phrases that moved people without baiting them. Range intrusion, non-compliant target, collision risk, data preservation. He put alien in the bin with words that got you attention and took your agency. He called his kids' school and offered to talk about flight for career day. He left out carriers and classified gear. He brought a model of a trainer and a stack of weather charts. He told a room of 10-year-olds that flying is mostly listening. To the air, to the jet, to your own limits. On the way out, his kid took his hand and said, "You still sound like a pilot." He squeezed back. "I still am. Just not the way I was." He started jogging with 2 other grounded flyers at dawn. They didn't talk for the first mile. Then one said, "You ever think about getting in a small plane?" He considered it. weighed the tremor that used to live in his fingers against the steadiness he'd earned. "Not yet," he said. "Maybe later." Later wasn't a dodge anymore. It was a plan. He wrote a note to himself and taped it to the inside of his front door. Protect crews. Protect truth. Don't become the story. It kept him narrow when the world tried to drag him toward microphones or message boards. He took a call from a journalist he respected and said no, not because he feared questions, but because he knew his mission wasn't to feed a narrative. It was to build a guardrail. Discipline became therapy, boundaries where adrenaline used to be. On a bright Saturday, he drove the long way to the coast, pulled into a turnout, and stared at the horizon where sky and water pretended to be a single thing. For a second, his chest grabbed the memory of a wave-top hold and a wind that didn't matter. He breathed through it and let the stillness be just stillness. He counted to 6, held 2, and let 6 go. His body didn't argue. He kept mentoring. He joined a small volunteer group that trained aircrews on just culture, how to report honestly without expecting punishment. He rewrote slides so UAP didn't trip anyone's reflexes. He added a case vignette stripped of drama. Crew sees A. Non-compliant unknown, logs UAP, data auto-preserved, safety alerts other flights, training adjusts vectors. No headlines, just safer air. The psychology was baked into the flow: reduce shame, increase reporting, lower risk. He learned to live with the ground. He learned to speak to rooms that preferred facts without losing the human cost. He learned that a career can end and leave the work intact. When he laced his shoes each morning, he didn't pretend he'd chosen all of this. He had chosen what to do next. That was enough. One night, months later, he parked by the municipal airfield again. This time he rolled down the window and let the engine noise wash over him. He thought about the first time he watched without panic, and the second and the third. He smiled, small and real. He turned the key, drove home, and laid out the notes for a briefing the following week. New unit, same message. Document everything. Protect each other. Treat unknowns like weather. He didn't need a cockpit to fly that into the system. Resolution and meaning. He didn't beat the sky. He learned to live with what it withheld, and silence almost cost him more than the encounter did. Until these events are logged like icing in wind shear. Procedures first, pride second. Pilots will keep paying in sleep, in careers, and sometimes in metal. If you want the inside stories they won't put in the logs, subscribe. Watch our next episode on nuclear site incursions to see how close this risk gets to home, and why air safety and national security keep tripping over each other in the